Howdy folks, did you all have a good weekend? Yes? No? Well, forget it, doesn't matter, because now it's Monday. Welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Advert free, thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon. Assuming, of course, I actually remember to go ahead and disable the adverts after uploading and publishing the video this time. It's been a fairly busy week, as you can tell by the on-screen activities. I managed to get into The Division 2 private beta. Now, I don't want to turn this episode of Mingles with Jingles into a The Division 2 preview video, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to be doing a video on this game this week, but suffice to say that if you were a fan of the original Division, and I realise a lot of you out there weren't, and for very good reasons, but if you were a fan of the original Division, you're probably really going to enjoy the sequel, because it's basically more of the same, although it's obviously a different environment this time around. It's not Manhattan, it's set in Washington DC, but other than the change of scenery, they've pretty much not messed around with the core gameplay mechanics. There are obviously differences, but if you know how to play the Division, you pretty much know how to play the Division 2. But there is a lot more going on. There's a lot more variety in the things to see and do around Washington DC than there was in Manhattan in the original Division. There are some new mechanics. Well, not entirely new mechanics, it's more that they've expanded and built upon some of the existing mechanics from the original game, particularly when it comes to your base of operations, which I thought was a fantastic feature of the original game, in that it basically existed as a sort of an extension of your character itself. As you progressed through the game and upgraded your base of operations, you actually were effectively upgrading your own character at the same time, which I thought was a fantastic concept. And was kind of disappointed that once it was sort of done, that was it. They never really bothered expanding on it. Well, they're expanding on it in a big way here in the sequel, which I was very, very happy to see. But again, I'm not going to continue going into too much detail about the Division 2 here in Mingles with Jingles, because I do anticipate pushing a video out on this private beta at some point in the upcoming week. And I'll talk more about it then. Nevertheless, I did enjoy it. And if you are a fan of the original Division, you're probably going to enjoy this too. I spent many hours during the course of the private beta aimlessly wandering around Washington DC and getting myself killed in all kinds of new and interesting ways. So all of that coming up at some point this week. Next up, let's talk about gaming news in general, or more specifically, big games publishers. I know it's fashionable to hate on Electronic Arts, but well, they absolutely deserve it. The thing about Electronic Arts is their troubles with their share prices have been absolutely predictable. First, there was the public relations disaster with the loot boxes in Star Wars Battlefront 2 a year ago, which saw their share prices take a bit of a hit. Now, they very publicly backed down from that, but that didn't do anything to help their share price, because as far as their investors were concerned, if they're not selling loot boxes in one of their flagship titles, then they're basically losing 50% of the revenue from that flagship title. Now, of course, they only stopped selling loot boxes in Star Wars Battlefront 2. They were still pushing them as hard as they possibly could in all of their other titles, particularly their sports titles. So it was all hands aboard the gravy train, at least until several governments decided to start investigating whether or not selling loot boxes in games was a form of gambling. And famously, of course, Belgium decided that it was, and ordered them to cease and desist doing it in all of the games that they sold in Belgium. And then Electronic Arts went and did it again. They said, "Who the hell do you think you are to tell us what we can and can't do?" They then promptly turned around and told the Belgian government to go and screw itself. They'll see you in court. Which of course is their right. But, well, here's the thing. Just because you can challenge a government's decisions in court doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Because all Electronic Arts were doing was sending the signal to the world that if they wanted to push gambling to children, it was their God-given right to do so. They have since backed down and are no longer challenging the court case. But the damage had already been done at that point. So it came as no great surprise to me to see that Electronic Arts stocks were down from their 2018 high point by 40.7% in November of 2018. That's a loss of billions of dollars off their share price. Now, they have since rallied, of course. but they're still down by more than 15% on the year. And because it's Electronic Arts, I'm not entirely surprised. Despite the fact that they've made billions, absolute billions in profits on their games, their handling of public relations over the course of the last year has been such an unmitigated dumpster fire that it doesn't entirely surprise me. And much the same can be said of Bethesda, with the unmitigated dumpster fire that was Fallout 76. But it's not just Electronic Arts and Bethesda. Take-Two, despite publishing what is one of the biggest video game success stories of 2018, Red Dead Redemption 2, were down nearly 20% on their share price in the same period. And there was further bad news for Activision Blizzard, down nearly 36% on their share price in the same period. And let's not forget, Activision Blizzard posted record profits in the first quarter of 2018 and expanded their Overwatch League franchise for record prices in multiple new areas of the world, including China. So what the hell is going on with the share prices that they should be dropping by nearly 36% in the same year that they're announcing record profits? Now, to some degree, you can understand these record drops in share prices coming out in November of 2018 when you look at the big publishers' release schedules for the Christmas season. Electronic Arts only just managed to squeeze Battlefield 5 in after it was delayed. Take-Two was still pushing Red Dead Redemption 2 as hard as they possibly could, but they'd already gotten over the initial swell of release sales. Blizzard Activision had basically nothing, and Bethesda would probably have been better off with nothing rather than what they had, which was Fallout 76. But even taking into account these kind of seasonal variations, most of the big publishers still ended up 15% down overall in 2018 on their share prices, with the exception of Take-Two, who, despite the blip in November, when their overall stocks were down 35% from their 2018 high, they did still manage to finish the year 3% up. But not so the likes of Blizzard Activision and Electronic Arts. And remember this in a year where Blizzard Activision had published record profits in the first quarter of the year, and in which Electronic Arts had published Call of Duty Black Ops 4 and Battlefield 5. So what the hell's going on? Did these games just not sell? Were they just not making any money out of them? Oh no, quite the contrary. They were making obscene amounts of money out of the sales of these games. Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first one that I'm going to look at is a thing that they call MAUs, monthly active users, and in the case of Activision Blizzard at least, because they haven't really produced anything new throughout all of 2018 other than, well, there was Call of Duty Black Ops 4 and the expansion, the Battle for Azeroth expansion for World of Warcraft. But Activision Blizzard's monthly active users across all of their games, whether that's the Call of Duty franchise, World of Warcraft, Overwatch, Hearthstone, Heroes of the Storm, Candy Crush Saga, their monthly active users in the third quarter of 2018 were 345 million. That seems like a lot. It is a lot. It's a ridiculous number of people. And don't forget, these are active users. These are people who are actually logging into and playing Activision Blizzard's games. These are not people who finally kicked their World of Warcraft habit and have let their accounts expire and are no longer playing. These are people who are actually logging into their games and playing their games at least every month. 345 million of them. So why is this bad? Well, it's not bad, far from it. They're literally shitting money. But it's down from 384 million in the previous quarter. And so we're going to come across an expression that all of the big publishers have been bandying around in the last few months. Their games are performing below expectations. Let's just take a quick look at Call of Duty Black Ops 4, which set a whole bunch of records when it went on sale. During its 3-day launch weekend, they posted sales of $500 million, $500 million in just 3 days. Far Cry 5, which up until that point had been the biggest success story of 2018, only, and I can't believe I'm using the word only here, only managed $310 million of sales in its entire first week. In the first 3 days of its release, Black Ops 4 set a new Call of Duty record for the most combined number of players, average hours per player, total number of hours played on current generation consoles, and based on minutes watched, it delivered the highest level of viewership throughout the launch weekend on Twitch in the franchise's history. It was by any standard a monumental success. I mean, $500 million in 3 days. What's not to like? Well, apparently if you live in the same fantasy land as major games publisher executives and shareholders, there was plenty to not like because, according to them, Call of Duty Black Ops 4 performed below expectations. Just let that sink in for a minute. A game that broke multiple records on launch and generated $500 million in sales in its first weekend is performing below expectations. It turns out that some people are just not going to be happy unless they've earned all of the money in the world, and anything less is below their expectations. And it's not just Call of Duty Black Ops 4. Destiny 2 performed below expectations. Battlefield 5 performed below expectations. You see, a large part of what's going on here is the ridiculously high expectations that are being set by the games publishing executives at Electronic Arts, Blizzard, Activision, Take-Two. They're forecasting these ridiculously high sales of whatever game they have next coming out of the pipeline every time the annual general shareholders meeting comes around. If they want their shareholders to keep investing in the company and continue to drive the share price up, therefore attracting even more investors, they have to keep promising their investors the moon on a stick when it comes to whichever new game is being released next. It always has to perform better than its predecessor. But games don't always perform better than their predecessors. They're not always better games than their predecessors. Look at Mass Effect Andromeda. Look at Fallout 76. But what about when a game is wildly successful? How can it still be performing below expectations? Call of Duty Black Ops 4, $500 million in its first 3 days. Even Battlefield 5, which received mixed reviews, shipped with a solo campaign but not the Battle Royale mode, and still managed to sell 7.3 million copies across all platforms. There are publishers out there who would kill to sell 7.3 million copies of whichever game is in the pipeline next. But it's just not enough for Electronic Arts, is it? Battlefield 5 performed below expectations because they were expecting to shift at least 8 million copies. Call of Duty Black Ops 4, $500 million in just its first 3 days of release alone, below expectations. If that's below expectations, just what exactly were they promising their shareholders in the first place? I mean, seriously, what kind of fantasy land are these people living in, where just earning almost all of the money in the world isn't quite enough? It's not what they were promised. And so the shareholders sell their stocks, and the stock price plummets, despite earning $500 million in just the first 3 days of release, because that is below the expectations that were set by the publishers. I think Jim Sterling summed it up best. I mean, what do Electronic Arts and Activision Blizzard do when they finally earned all of the money in the world? Do they have to suddenly start promising their shareholders money that doesn't even exist in order to get them to continue investing? Seriously, where does this end? Now, it would be perfectly understandable at this point for you to be sitting there thinking, well, this is all very amusing, Jingles, but why should we give a shit? So Electronic Arts and Activision Blizzard's stock prices have taken a hit. Good. It serves them right, the greedy bastards. What has this got to do with us? That's a very good question, and I'm very glad you asked, because it's shit like this that's getting games cancelled and is getting development studios shut down, irrespective of the actual quality and sales of the games that they produce, because they're always performing below these stupidly high expectations set by the publishers. Let me take you back to the year 2013. If you can remember that far back, there was a reasonably popular game franchise that went by the name of Dead Space, developed by Visceral Entertainment and published by Electronic Arts. And in 2013, Dead Space 3 was released, and it did pretty well, considering it's about as niche a game as you can get. I mean, space horror games, they're not exactly mass market appeal. Even Alien Isolation, which in my opinion is one of the best games ever made, still didn't break sales records. I mean, it didn't do badly, but it certainly didn't set the world on fire. Because at the end of the day, there are just more people who are into military squad-based shooters, particularly these days with battle royale modes. And a game like Alien Isolation and Dead Space was never going to appeal to the broad section of the market that something like Call of Duty Black Ops 4 would. But still, it shifted around about 3.1 million copies. Guess what? This was below Electronic Arts' expectations. I mean, they wanted 5 million. I'm sorry, but no science fiction horror game is going to shift 5 million copies, regardless of who's publishing it. At the time, Electronic Arts Label's president said, "You need to get to audience sizes of around 5 million." Oh, God. I can't believe he's saying this with a straight face. To really continue to invest in an intellectual property like Dead Space. And at the same time, emphatically denied that Electronic Arts were cancelling development of Dead Space 4. Now, we all remember Dead Space 4, don't we? No, that's right, we don't. Because Electronic Arts cancelled development of Dead Space 4, fired everybody at Visceral Entertainment, and shut the studio down. Because a niche science fiction horror game only managed to sell 3.1 million copies, 1.9 million copies short of their expectations. So while it's tempting to just sit here and laugh and point with glee at the tumbling share prices of Electronic Arts and Activision Blizzard, at the end of the day, the only people who are going to suffer for it are the games developers working hard for these mega publishers who continue, despite all evidence to the contrary, to push out games that continue to perform below the expectations of the publishers. While we're on the subject of the utter ridiculousness of modern economics, the thing you have to understand about me is that I actually led quite a sheltered life, despite being in the military for 22 years. You see, I was born into a generation that was known as Generation X. We came after the baby boomers, who followed on from World War II, but we preceded the millennials, which is probably accounting for most of you guys. And we were the last generation to grow up with the expectation that we would leave school or college or university without a crippling debt, walk into a job and expect to have that job for the rest of our lives. During the course of that job, we would be able to earn enough to buy our own home, take our families on holiday or, vacation if you're in America, at least once a year, and to be able to retire with a comfortable pension. We were also the first generation to come to realise that this was not necessarily going to be the case anymore. Although for most of the members of my generation, it's still an achievable goal, particularly if we already own our own home. But like I said, I've kind of had a bit of a sheltered experience. Not really typical of most Generation Xers, because I was in the military for 22 years. I basically failed all my exams at school, bummed around working in bars for a couple of years, and then I joined the Royal Navy. Did that for 22 years, and during the course of that time, I didn't have to worry about healthcare, I didn't have to worry about money. Pretty much all of my needs were looked after. The Navy fed me, it clothed me, it housed me, it looked after my health, and I got a very good pension out of it. And then, of course, after that, the whole YouTube thing happened, and I was incredibly lucky that it proved to be as successful as it has been. So I've kind of had the Generation X experience, even though I was kind of at the tail end of the whole Generation X thing, in that I haven't had to worry about things like healthcare. Am I going to be able to earn enough to eat? Am I going to have a roof over my head? And what's going to happen when I retire? Am I going to have a pension? Things like that. The kind of things that I've been becoming sort of vaguely aware that the current generation, the millennials, have to deal with. But because I've had such a completely different experience, thanks to being born in the generation that I was and being as lucky as I have been, I never really realised just exactly how terrifying an experience it should be for the people of the current generation. And yet it doesn't seem to be scaring anybody. The kind of situation that you guys are in, if you took a Generation Xer and put them into that situation, they would shit themselves. So, what you're talking about, Jingles, let me explain. Because I've got a genuine question here for the millennials amongst us. All of those people who did leave school with crippling debts, who don't have a pension to look forward to, who might not even be able to enjoy the benefits of healthcare. Here's the question, and it's a very important question, and I genuinely want to know the answer to it. What are you working for? Seriously, when you get out of bed in the morning and you go to work, why do you bother? Here's the reason why I ask. The reason why Generation Xers got out of bed in the morning and went to work was so that they could earn enough to buy their own house, to have equity, because that's basically all that, unless you're, in the top 1% of the population with, 90% of the wealth, owning your own home is pretty much the best that you can aspire to, because it provided you with security for you and your family. And so you dutifully got out of bed every day and you went to work in order to buy that home. And once you'd bought the home, you continued to get out of bed every day and go to work in order to pay off the mortgage on the home. And once you'd paid off the mortgage, you were pretty much on the gravy train from there on in. Anything else that you earned went towards your retirement. And for my generation, this was not an unrealistic goal. In the 1960s, in the United Kingdom, the average price of a house was around about 3 times the annual salary. And even if you couldn't afford to buy your house outright, and most people couldn't, you could walk into a bank or a building society and get a 100% mortgage, a mortgage with no deposit, and expect to be able to earn enough to pay that off within 10 to 15 years. These days, things are very, very different. For a start, most people are leaving education crippled with debt in the first place before they even get a job. And a lot of the jobs that people are working these days are not the kind of jobs that any member of my generation would have even entertained the idea of choosing as a means of earning a living. For one thing, a lot of people these days don't actually work full-time jobs. And while there's nothing particularly wrong with part-time employment, the part-time employment that most people are working today looks an awful lot like the full-time employment that members of my generation enjoyed, except without all of the benefits like healthcare, pension funds, and the right to not be fired at a second's notice. Now, I'm probably not telling you lot anything you don't already know, but I was absolutely horrified when I found out that a lot of people, in some cases the majority of people in certain age brackets, are actually working on short-term contracts with their employers. And they're doing that, of course, because it means that the employer can fire them whenever they like. If they don't want to renew the contract, they just don't have to, and they don't have to give any reason. And they don't have to do things like pay insurance for their employees. They don't have to contribute towards pension funds for their employees. And they certainly don't have to provide their employees anything even approaching basic healthcare. I was absolutely horrified when it became apparent to me that this is how a lot of people today are actually earning a living. If you took a member of my generation and said that's how you're going to earn a living for the rest of your life, there would have been a revolution. We just wouldn't have stood for it. But apparently this is quite normal today. Although in some cases, those kind of employment conditions are actually better than what people can expect. I was recently reading a book called How to Be Right. It's written by the radio journalist James O'Brien. He's a bit of a lefty, but he does make some good points. I'm going to quote you a bit here. He was talking about somebody who used to phone into his radio show, went by the name of Arthur, worked as a driver for a company that had a contract to deliver white goods for a major online high street retailer. Arthur and his partner, because moving fridges is a two-man job, are not employed by the delivery company directly, but rather they have a contract that requires them to undertake a certain amount of deliveries while paying the company for the use of their van. That's right. Arthur pays for the privilege of going to work in a van owned by a company that pays him no sick pay, no holiday pay, no health care, and no pension contributions. So he's technically self-employed, but he's obviously unable to work for another company or employer except over and above his already full-time schedule. Indeed, if one of them is ill or otherwise indisposed and unable to find their own replacement, the rent for the van is still due. This means that in 21st century Britain, getting sick while holding down a relatively menial job sees the sick person not just lose their wage for the days off they're sick, but actually pay money to their employer, who's not technically their employer, because then he'd have to give them sick pay, insurance, and so on, for every day they're off the road. When was the last time you ordered something from Amazon? I do it all the time. I've usually got deliveries from Amazon arriving every week. Until recently, I never stopped to think about what it must be actually like to work as an Amazon courier. Frankly, it sounds horrifying. I was reading an article recently on www.inc.com. I'll put a link to the article in the video description. And it was commenting on a bunch of interviews with 31 different Amazon delivery drivers that had been conducted by a magazine called Business Insider. It's probably important to state at the beginning that none of these people actually work directly for Amazon. Instead, they work for the shipping contractors that Amazon hires to handle its logistics. In almost all cases, they were refused overtime pay, despite the fact that all of them work more than 40 hours a week. Because most of these guys are not full-time employees in the sense that I would expect, and instead were working to these contracts, they could have their contract terminated without notice at any time. And so it was not unusual for the employers to terminate the contracts before they'd worked more than 90 days, because after 90 days, in a lot of cases, the employer would have been forced to start paying them health insurance. Most of them were also expected to stick to utterly ridiculous delivery schedules, often being expected to deliver between 200 and 300 packages in a 9-hour shift. This is a 9-hour shift, which is supposed to include a half-hour break for lunch and 2 15-minute bathroom breaks. Just do the maths. Never mind 300 packages. If you're only delivering 200 packages, and you do take the hour off for lunch and going to the toilet, in an 8-hour shift, you would have to be delivering a package every 2 minutes and 24 seconds to deliver the 200 that you're expected to. So, of course, many of them ended up working overtime in order to finish their deliveries. And, of course, none of them got paid for the extra hours that they were putting in. The alternative, to work the 9-hour shift and then just return the undelivered packages to the depot, would get them fired. So you've got people working under these kind of conditions, not working full-time employment, working to contracts with no health insurance, no pension, no sick pay, nothing that my generation took for granted. You can't afford to buy your own home, which was the goal for my generation. And the reason you can't afford to buy your own home is, well, you're getting paid less than my generation. A study conducted in the year 2016 here in the UK discovered that 20-somethings, the millennial generation, were earning £8,000 a year less than the previous generation, and house prices, back in my day, a house which you could buy with a 100% mortgage without putting any money down, zero deposit, the price of the house was 3 times your annual salary. So your annual salary is less than what my annual salary was, and houses these days cost 8 times the national average salary. So most of you are never going to own your own home. You're never going to have that long-term financial security. And those of you who attended university are coming out of university with nearly £60,000 of debt that I never had, because in my day university education was free. But you are still paying rent. And by the time you reach retirement age with no pension, you're going to have paid some landlord the price of 3 mortgages in rent over the course of your life. And you've got nothing to show for it. No insurance, no healthcare, no home, no pension, no retirement. So, my question is this, to all you guys and girls who are part of the millennial generation, for whom this is perfectly normal, why do you even bother to get out of bed in the morning if this is all you have to look forward to? My generation just would not have stood for this. There would have been, well, this is the UK, so it wouldn't have been an armed insurrection. It would have been reasonably polite. As Eddie Izzard is famous for saying, we would have stormed the Houses of Parliament, kicked the fucking doors in, said, look, we're sorry, we'll pay for the damage, but this shit needs to change. So why do you put up with it? I genuinely do not understand. And on that thoroughly depressing bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I won't go so far as to say I hope you enjoyed it, because it's probably been an incredibly depressing episode. But I hope it's given you something to think and talk about down below in the comments. And please do leave a comment letting me know what you think or what your experience is, because I am genuinely interested to know just exactly what it is that motivates people of the millennial generation to bother to do anything. Anyway, that's it for this week. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.